They said Mali would fall. They said it would drown in chaos, crushed between terrorists, embargoes, and coups. But what if the collapse they predicted was not a sign of failure, but a sign of rebellion? In a world where truth is filtered through diplomacy, the Sahel became the stage of a new war. Not a war of conquest, but a war of reclamation. And Mali stood at the center of it. As the American diplomat warned of a fuel blockade, Mali was already turning fire into resolve. While France whispered of coups and jihadism, it was the Malian voice that broke through. For more than a decade, terrorism has been imposed and supported by foreign state sponsors. Our populations are being cowardly murdered. Economic terrorism is now their tool. This is not just a story of soldiers or sanctions. It's the story of a nation refusing to be erased. Standing where maps were forged in colonial ink, and saying, "We draw our lines now." If you believe the battle for Africa is more than headlines, like, comment and subscribe. Because what's happening in Mali is not the end of a story. It's the start of a reckoning. At the United Nations, the masks fell. The U.S. declared,
Al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorists in the Sahel have paralyzed Mali with a fuel blockade. The United States acknowledges the counterterrorism efforts of the Malian armed forces against these and other terrorist organizations such as ISIS, Sahel, but the situation is worsening quickly. Since the veto of the UN sanctions regime in 2023, it has been deeply disappointing to see Mali's security situation continue to deteriorate.
France followed suit, warning of Russian influence and denouncing the 2021 coup. But the room shifted when Mali spoke, not just for itself, but for the entire AES.
Ladies and gentlemen, this meeting is of particular importance for the member states of the AIS Confederation, namely Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Indeed, for more than a decade, West Africa in general, and the Sahel in particular, have been confronted with terrorism imposed and supported by foreign state sponsors. Our populations, including women and children, are being cowardly murdered, or subjected to unspeakable violence, forced into exile, or simply deprived of access to essential social services. This abhorrent violence spares neither schools nor health centers. And since they can no longer stand up to our brave defense and security forces, the criminal groups are now reduced to economic terrorism, which consists of attacking civilian infrastructure and supply routes. The defense and security forces of the Confederation of Sahel States fight together courageously and tirelessly. Criminal and obscurantist organizations, I would like here to pay a particularly heartfelt tribute to our confederal forces for the sacrifices they make every day to secure our territories, our populations, and their property.
And that's when the war of words turned into a war of maps. When Mali's armed forces began pushing back with shocking speed and coordination, the enemy changed its face. No longer the masked insurgent striking military bases, now it was the man with the detonator at a pipeline, the saboteur hiding near a power grid, the shadow behind the blockade. The term economic terrorism once sounded theoretical. In the Sahel, it became doctrine. Fuel tankers were burned on their way to Mopti. The Gao supply depot was bombed. Niger's oil pipeline, the one linking to Mali, was blasted open. These weren't just isolated acts of sabotage. They were coordinated, timed, funded. And yet, in Western media, all of this vanished behind a wall of euphemisms: deteriorating infrastructure, lack of state capacity, development challenges. But the people of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger knew what was happening. This was siege warfare, designed not to conquer land, but to strangle the will of a people. And the casualties weren't soldiers. They were children walking 10 kilometers to find water. Mothers giving birth in clinics with no power. Merchants trying to get food through ambushed roads. 4 million displaced. 15,000 schools closed. Over 900 health facilities abandoned. And still, no outcry from the international community. But the real betrayal came when these same saboteurs claimed the role of saviors. "We remain deeply concerned," said the American representative. "We must support Mali against terrorism," echoed the French envoy. But behind closed doors, behind aid language and defense funds, were contracts, intelligence briefings, and shifting proxies. In northern Mali, after every attack on a convoy, someone knew exactly where it would be. Spy aircraft traced troop movements. Satellite images were leaked. Surveillance drones flew over Malian territory with impunity. These weren't coincidences. These were systems. And when direct attacks on military sites failed, they turned to public infrastructure. This is how you destabilize a sovereign state in the 21st century. Not with tanks. But with famine. With blackout. With fear. And yet, Mali stood. Not just stood, adapted. They began rerouting supply chains through secure corridors. Engineers worked around bombed infrastructure. Civilians volunteered in logistics. And every failure became a lesson. Every ambush taught a countermove. Because this was no longer a war against rebels. It was a war against dependency itself. In villages once overlooked, new local assemblies formed. Community defense units sprang up. Where fuel was scarce, solar grids were deployed. Where roads were cut, radio relays kept the AES connected. This was the rise of an African mode of resistance, flexible, decentralized, unyielding. And slowly, the fear began to shift back. Because if Mali could survive without bowing, what would that mean for the others? If Burkina Faso could rebuild under siege, what would that signal to ECOWAS? If Niger could send oil to its neighbor without French approval, what would that mean for all of West Africa? This is where the war turned psychological. Where every convoy that arrived became a message. Every market that reopened became an act of defiance. So the attacks continued. But something else began to rise. Not just military resilience. But political clarity. People started to see the contradiction. How can the same powers supplying arms to fight terrorism also hold the intelligence networks that seem to enable it? How can those who bombed Libya into chaos now sell lectures on regional stability? They support the terrorists in secret, said one AES official. Then sell us solutions in public. Midway through a ruined village in Douentza, a soldier quietly told a journalist. We're not just fighting jihadists. We're fighting the ghost of colonization. And that's the truth Mali uncovered. The terror in the Sahel was never just about religion, or ideology. It was engineered dependency. A pipeline of control. From borders drawn in Europe to policies shaped in Paris, to drone flights justified in Washington. But something broke that chain. It wasn't just bullets. It was belief. A belief that sovereignty isn't a gift. It's a fight. If you believe that fight deserves to be heard, not silenced, share your thoughts below. Comment, not as an observer, but as someone who refuses to look away. Because the fuel blockade failed. The sabotage failed. And yet, they're still afraid.
We face the risk of a disastrous domino effect across the entire region. Many countries are reeling. And terrorism in the Sahel is not only a regional dramatic reality.
Therefore, I would like to call on members of this Council, and indeed the international community as a whole, to help us build trust. No amount of money, no amount of equipment will help us overcome terrorism if we don't collaborate and build synergy.
They told us this war was about terrorism. They lied. It was always about resources. The deeper you go into the Sahel, the clearer the pattern becomes, wherever the earth is rich. The land becomes cursed. Gold, gas, uranium, not blessings, but invitations. Invitations to meddle, invade, destabilize. Nowhere is this more evident than in northern Mali. Long under French control, the Kidal region became a theater not just of insurgency, but of extraction. For years, while Mali fought jihadists on its soil, oil quietly flowed north, not to Malian markets, but across the Algerian border. Pipelines and gas networks running from Kidal to Algeria, supplying their clients with oil that did not belong to them. France knew. Algeria orchestrated. The people of Mali, deceived. And when France finally withdrew, something happened that no one in Paris expected. Malians began asking questions. Why had this zone, home to Tahalandak, one of the most resource-rich zones near Algeria, always been a no-go area? Why were drone flights, even under counter-terrorism mandates, focused disproportionately in the north? Why did every map since colonization push Mali's border southward, as if the real Mali was being slowly erased? It was never about jihad. It was about jurisdiction. We realized, said a former officer, that the war wasn't just being fought with bullets. It was being fought with maps. Maps that favored pipelines. Maps that ignored tribal boundaries. Maps that split communities and concentrated wealth in unreachable hands. And so came the Second War, not on the battlefield, but over geography itself. As AES forces reclaimed control, Malians discovered something long buried beneath anti-terror zones. Infrastructure. Wells. Oil markers. Satellite towers. It was as if the jihadists were guarding someone else's treasure. And when the military finally cleared the Tahalandak area, the truth was too visible to hide. This was not chaos. It was coordination. This was not lawlessness. It was logistics. Smuggling routes ran with impunity into southern Algeria. Armed groups received supplies by air. Tuareg factions, some of them armed by foreign intelligence during the Libyan War, became de facto border agents, determining who passed and who didn't. And the same nations who condemned the AES for lack of democracy, were quietly signing mining contracts behind closed doors. Mali, it turns out, is not poor. It is plundered. But plunder has a limit, and Mali had reached it. When Mali closed its skies to French aircraft, when it reasserted control over the northern corridors, it wasn't just about security. It was about sovereignty. It was about reclaiming stolen land. And so the attacks intensified. Western diplomats cried foul over human rights. Media headlines shifted, military junta. Wagner involvement, anti-Western rhetoric. But the timing gave them away. Because each new denunciation came exactly as Mali took one more step toward controlling its own wealth. Close a French base. Accused of tyranny. Reclaim a gold field. Labeled a pariah. Stop an illegal pipeline. Threatened with sanctions. When gold runs beneath your feet, your enemies don't need to invade. They just need to tell the world you're unstable. And so Mali was called many things. But never what it truly is, strategic. Strategic not just because of location, but because of resistance. Strategic because it dared to ask. What if Africa stopped exporting value and importing violence? That's what made Mali dangerous. Because Tahalandak was just one point. Across the Sahel, similar stories emerged. In Niger, uranium mines once controlled by Areva, now being renegotiated. In Burkina Faso, artisanal gold zones, suddenly receiving military attention after years of neglect. In Mali, lithium deposits once meant for export, now under review. And each time, the same pattern. First come the accusations. Then come the drones. Then the dialogue missions. But this time, Africa is not alone. AES states share intelligence. Share logistics. Share memory. They know that the battle for resources is the battle for borders, and that colonial lines were never meant to last. So they draw new ones. Not with pens in Paris, but with blood, and courage, and conviction. And perhaps that is what frightens the old powers most. That the African is no longer asking for inclusion. He is demanding restitution. He is not begging for investment. He is enforcing access to what is already his. What if the map of Mali is incomplete, asked one commander. What if our true size was never acknowledged? It's a question they dare not answer. Because if the map is wrong, then so is everything built on top of it, contracts, claims, concessions. And if Mali reclaims the north, then others might reclaim what lies beneath their own soil. So this is not just Mali's fight. This is a referendum on every lie ever printed on a colonial map. And the Sahel is voting with fire. Nobody expected them to last. Certainly not win. When the West trains an army, they talk about 10 years to create an elite unit. Decades to reach operational maturity. But Mali didn't wait for a certificate from Paris. It built a new army, while fighting. And it didn't copy the Western model. It created its own. This was African warfare, born not in think tanks, but on the battlefield. Nobody believed the Malians had this type of capability, one analyst admitted. Nobody expected their response time to be this superb. Because they didn't understand the terrain. They didn't understand the rhythm of the Sahel. They underestimated what it means to fight with no backup, no air cover, no imported drones, only will. The war changed when Mali embraced what others discarded. Instead of mimicking NATO logistics, they mapped footpaths. Instead of relying on air support, they built networks of community scouts. Instead of following Western doctrine, they studied how the jihadists moved, then reversed it. Fast. Asymmetric. Relentless. In the past, Mali was trained to respond after an attack. Now they anticipated. And when JNIM moved toward Sumpi, they didn't find a target. They found a trap. Cumbri was the turning point. What was supposed to be a quick strike on an AES outpost turned into a 5-day counteroffensive. JNIM fighters, supplied with intel and equipment, expected a weak defense. What they encountered was an integrated wall. Regular forces. Local militia. Drone operators. Terrain scouts. And perhaps most lethal of all, experience. Because by now, every battle had taught Mali something. And they wrote it down. They built doctrine from the ashes of their own wounds. At Cumbri, AES forces didn't hold the ground. They maneuvered around it. They let the insurgents enter, then collapsed the flanks. One by one, their escape routes were sealed. And when the ambush ended, 74 enemy fighters were dead. The rest vanished into sand. But this time, no one claimed victory on Twitter. Because this wasn't for show. This was survival. We realized we don't need to win headlines. A FAMA officer later said. We just need to win the hour. And they did. In Gao, they fortified intersections. In Mopti, they established overlapping radio zones. In Sigu, they built mobile hospitals that traveled with units. But the greatest weapon was not hardware. It was trust. Trust between soldier and civilian. Between command and ground. Between state and village. Because unlike foreign armies, the AES wasn't occupying, it was defending its own soil. And people responded. Locals stopped reporting AES positions to the enemy. Instead, they began tipping off the army, warning of strange trucks. New fighters, weapons hidden in grain sacks. Women sent messages through marketplace code. Children pointed out drone markers drawn in dirt. The enemy started losing more than territory. They lost invisibility. That changed everything. Because once Mali saw them, Mali could chase them. And chase they did, through dunes, forests, rivers. Where once the rebels dictated the fight. Now they were on the run. But this wasn't just a military pivot. It was a psychological reversal. Before, when drone footage appeared in Western media, it showed chaos. Now, those same angles showed control. Before, every attack was proof of collapse. Now, every counterattack was proof of evolution. Even the foreign press began to stumble. Was Mali losing? Or changing? The question reached Washington. It echoed in Paris. It crept into ECOWAS strategy meetings. Because no one had expected this. They planned for disarray, not for adaptation. They prepared narratives for failure, not for resolve. But the battlefield said otherwise. And the truth was becoming harder to hide. Even UN briefings began to mention it. The capability and response of the Malian armed forces were unexpected. Unexpected. But not accidental. This transformation had fingerprints. It bore the mark of national memory, of a people who remembered colonization, betrayal, and broken promises. And who swore, this time, it would be different. No longer waiting for aid. No longer accepting imported strategy. No longer asking how the West fought, but why it failed. They studied Vietnam. They studied Gaza. They studied themselves. And they found an answer. Win not by holding ground, but by denying control. Win not by visibility, but by resistance. This became the Mali Doctrine. A doctrine now taught across AES. In Burkina Faso, it took the form of forest campaigns, cutting supply lines to remote jihadist camps. In Niger, it meant rerouting fuel delivery to bypass sabotage zones. In Mali, it meant hitting enemy nodes, command centers, relay hubs, tunnel caches. It was counter-terrorism without permission. Sovereignty with scars. If you believe African warfare deserves to be studied, respected, and remembered, not erased, drop your comment. Let them know the Sahel is not a battlefield. It's a blueprint. And the results speak. By late 2025, AES reported a 47% drop in major attacks. Civilian casualties declined for the first time in 3 years. Food corridors reopened. Dozens of schools restarted classes. But the war isn't over. Because the enemy has changed again. Now, they whisper. They slander. They bribe. They try to fracture alliances from within. But Mali has seen too much to be fooled again. The army no longer trains just for ambush. It trains for narrative. It trains for betrayal. It trains for ghosts in suits who never touch the battlefield, but fund it from afar. Because that's the war now. And Mali is ready. Just when the enemy seemed cornered. The headlines changed. No more drone strikes or ambushes. Now it was words. Reports. Labels. Suddenly, Mali wasn't a frontline state, it was a military junta. Burkina Faso wasn't resisting terror, it was undermining democracy. Niger wasn't asserting independence, it was aligning with Russia. The battlefield moved to the screen. At the United Nations, the US warned of a fuel blockade by Al-Qaeda. But inside Mali, that same blockade had already been broken. France condemned the 2021 coup, yet applauded the 2014 Ukrainian coup. And when it came time to name jihadist factions, the West avoided one name above all. He did not mention the JNIM, the analyst said. Because that would throw France under the bus. It wasn't a slip. It was strategy. Because mentioning JNIM, Jama'at Nasr al-Islam wal Muslimin, would unravel the entire illusion. It would expose who benefited from their movement across Mali. Who turned a blind eye, who negotiated behind closed doors. And who armed them. The twist wasn't that Mali was under attack. It was that Mali's enemies wore suits. They spoke at press conferences. They signed security deals. And in the shadows, they moved weapons and passed coordinates. The US kept invoking Al-Qaeda, not because they feared it, but because they invented it. Al-Qaeda was trained by US Special Forces in Syria and Iraq, one veteran admitted. So when the West says, "We're here to help you fight terrorism," what they mean is, "We created the fire. Now pay us to bring water." And when Mali refused, they called it anti-democratic. They froze aid, cut off credit, flooded the media. Because Mali had done the one thing unforgivable in a post-colonial order: think for itself. They didn't just reject French troops. They questioned the entire premise of Western intervention. They didn't just close bases. They opened files, followed money, tracked arms, and found the twist behind the war. Terrorism was never just a threat. It was a business model. Destabilize, intervene, extract, repeat. But now the blueprint is exposed. The AES isn't just fighting insurgents. It's fighting a narrative machine, a web of think tanks, newsrooms, and NGOs that cloak the real war behind headlines. This is the final battlefield. Not the desert. Not the oil field. But the story. Who gets to tell it? Who gets to silence it? And who, at last, dares to rewrite it? The war in Mali is far from over. But something irreversible has begun. A nation that once fought with borrowed weapons now stands with forged will. A people once cornered by borders now redraw them with courage. They tried to erase Mali with fear. Instead, Mali wrote itself back into history. This is not the story of collapse. It's the story of return. Of reclamation. Of refusal. Refusal to be a base. Refusal to be a proxy. Refusal to be silent. And that refusal echoes across the Sahel. In the rebuilt clinics, the reopened schools. The soldiers who know their land like the back of their hands. This is how freedom sounds in the 21st century. Not with fanfare. But with footsteps. Not with permission. But with presence. If the fire of this resistance lives in you, like, comment, and subscribe. Because this is no longer just Mali's fight. It belongs to all of us. Now it's our turn. To carry the fire. To speak the truth. To guard the line.